The story you're about to hear isn't about a girl who died. It's about what happens when an entire town decides you're already dead and leaves you for the dust to claim. Dust rolled over Dead Willow, lazy and mean. It crept into the cracks in the window panes and settled in the lines on every face that called this forsaken place home. The wind carried no comfort, no news, just the dry rattle of a town holding its breath. And in the middle of it all, a girl lay crumpled in the dirt. She looked like a rag doll, tossed from a moving wagon and forgotten. One leg was bent the wrong way, a sickening angle beneath the faded calico of her dress. The other was a road map of bruises, plum dark and swollen. Her hands were scraped raw, her dark hair matted to her cheeks with sweat and something else. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She barely breathed. It was as if even the air had become too heavy a burden to bear. The sky, at least, was kind. It had clouded over, sparing her the sun's cruel glare. But the people were not kind. Inside the mercantile, old Mrs. Colby peered through the dusty glass, her face a mask of pity before turning away. Too much trouble. The preacher's boy, no older than 10, watched from the church steps, his little knees knocking together, until his mother snatched him by the collar and hissed a warning into his ear. And the law? The sheriff stood on the boardwalk, not 20 feet away. He lit his pipe, took a long, slow drag, and exhaled a cloud of smoke that mingled with the dust. He saw her. He saw everything. And he did nothing. Her name was Eloise May Carter. She was 17. But the things she'd seen had aged her 100 years. She'd come to Dead Willow just a year ago, on a wagon with her husband Jed. He was a quiet man, the kind who'd sweat through his shirt before the sun was high, but whose voice never rose above a whisper. He'd buried his own father and married Eloise in the same summer. People said he was lucky to get a girl like her. She had eyes like an evening storm, soft and dark and full of things she never gave words to. But luck runs out fast in a place like this. The first frost brought a fever, and that fever took Jed. It left Eloise a widow, a stranger in a strange town, and in the care of Jed's kin, Martha and Owen Carter. And their kindness was as thin as the creek in a drought. At first it was just silence. They ignored her, letting her eat the scraps she cooked for them, letting her sleep in the cold corner of the barn where the light never reached. But grief in a cruel heart doesn't stay grief for long. It curdles, it turns to poison. Soon their bitterness found a voice. Martha called her lazy. Owen accused her of stealing. Little things at first. A missing spoon, a few eggs. Then one day Jed's old hunting rifle vanished. Owen had likely pawned it himself for whiskey money, but he took his rage out on Eloise. He beat her until her lips split, and when folks asked about the bruises, he just grumbled something about a storm and a clumsy girl. No one questioned it. No one ever did. Last night it all came to a head. Owen had stormed into the barn, his breath thick with cheap whiskey, screaming about disgrace. Martha was right behind him, her face a twisted knot of fury, calling Eloise a burden, a leash, a sinner. They said she was stealing food, dishonoring Jed's memory. They dragged her out by her hair, and when her foot caught on a loose floorboard, there was a sharp, sickening crack that echoed in the night like a gunshot. They didn't stop. They didn't even slow down. They threw her in the back of a buckboard like a sack of garbage, drove her into the center of town, and dumped her in the dirt. Right there on the saloon steps, as if hoping the morning light would just sweep her away with the rest of the trash. That was 6 hours ago. The silence had become her whole world. Her breath was a shallow whisper. Her mind drifted away to a quieter time. A time before, when she used to hum while hanging laundry, when Jed carved her a little whistle from a piece of pine and called her his bird song. She remembered his hands, calloused and rough, but always so warm. Now her dress was stiff with sweat and dried blood. The dirt beneath her smelled of horse piss and stale tobacco. Every nerve in her body screamed for it all to just end. And then the wind shifted. A single boot scuffed the dirt beside her. Then another. She didn't look up. What was the point? It was just another pair of eyes come to stare at the broken thing in the street. But the man didn't just stare. He crouched down, slow and careful, like he was approaching a spooked deer. His shadow fell over her, a sudden relief from the gray, oppressive heat. "You breathing?" the man asked. His voice was rough, low, worn like an old fence post, but it wasn't unkind. Eloise blinked, just once, a flicker of life. The man nodded as if that one blink was all the answer he needed. Then he slid his arms under her, one beneath her shoulders, the other beneath her knees. She flinched, a groan tearing through her gritted teeth as a fresh wave of fire shot through her broken leg. "I got you," he said. The words were simple, a plain fact. He lifted her. She felt weightless, like she weighed less than the mountain of grief she carried. He smelled of wood smoke and cedar, and his rough wool coat scratched against her cheek. She cracked her eyes open just long enough to see the edge of a grizzled gray beard, the hard line of a jaw that looked like it hadn't known how to smile in a decade. The man carried her right down the middle of Main Street. He walked past the saloon, past the gawkers who quickly pretended they weren't staring. He walked right past Sheriff Pike. The sheriff took a step forward, pipe still in his hand, then stopped dead. A look of recognition and something else, maybe fear, flashed in his eyes. "Silas," the sheriff said, his voice barely a whisper, "you sure about this?" The man, Silas, didn't answer. He didn't even break his stride. He just kept walking, his heavy boots thudding against the dusty boards, carrying the broken girl away from the town that had left her to die. He was heading for the ridge, toward the old forgotten cabin that sat nestled in the juniper trees, a place no one in Dead Willow dared to go. And everyone watching knew, deep down in their gut, that whatever happened next, it wouldn't be simple. Nothing involving Silas Boone ever was. Silas carried her up the winding path to the ridge. The town of Dead Willow shrank below them, becoming a collection of sad, gray boxes in a dusty bowl. Up here, the air was different, cleaner. It smelled of pine and damp earth, of a world that didn't care about the petty cruelties of men. The cabin wasn't much to look at. The fence sagged, the wood was weathered gray by years of sun and snow. But the porch was swept clean, and a thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney. It was a place that was lived in, but not welcoming. It was a fortress of solitude. Inside, he laid her gently on a narrow cot. The sheets were rough, clean muslin, and the pillow was filled with cool straw. The pain was a living thing inside her, a roaring fire that consumed everything. She tried to sit up, but her body was a stranger to her, and it refused to obey. She fell back, gasping, her eyes focusing on the heavy, hand-hewn beams of the ceiling. "Name's Silas Boone," he said, breaking the silence. His voice filled the small room, leaving no space for argument. "Ain't much of a talker, but I know how to boil water and bind a wound. You got a name?" She couldn't find her voice. The words were trapped somewhere deep inside, behind a wall of pain and fear. He didn't press. He just turned, fetched a bucket of water from a well outside, and set it on the cast iron stove to boil. As the steam began to rise, he took out an old, well-worn hunting knife. It was clean, the blade honed to a razor's edge. With a single, precise movement, he sliced through the seam of her dress, exposing her shattered leg. The sight of it made her stomach turn. Her foot was swollen to twice its normal size, the skin a mottled canvas of blue and black. The bone beneath was angled all wrong, a clear and brutal break. He touched her ankle with 2 fingers, his touch surprisingly gentle. But the spark of pain it sent up her leg was so intense, she bit her lip hard enough to draw blood, just to keep from screaming. "Gonna have to set it," he said, his voice flat, stating a fact. "Won't lie to you. It'll hurt like hell." She gave a faint, jerky nod. He grabbed a bottle of whiskey from a high shelf. It wasn't for drinking. He poured a generous amount over the break, and the raw alcohol felt like fire being poured into her veins. He doused his own hands with it, then poured a measure into a chipped tin cup and held it out to her. She took it, her hands trembling. She drank. The whiskey was raw and potent, and it burned a path all the way down to her gut. It made her cough and gasp, and for the first time in weeks, tears welled in her eyes. But it wasn't a cry of sorrow. It was a cry of pure physical agony. "Ready?" he asked. She wasn't. She would never be ready. But she nodded anyway, and then he pulled. Her scream was not human. It was the sound of an animal caught in a steel trap, a sound of tearing, of breaking, of a soul being ripped from its moorings. It echoed out of the cabin, down the ridge, and over the silent, watching town of Dead Willow. It was a raw, primal thing, the kind of scream that cuts loose everything you've been holding inside. She passed out before he finished wrapping the splint. When she woke, night had fallen. The only light in the cabin was a single candle flickering on a small table beside her cot. The window was open, and the night air carried the cool, clean scent of pine. The pain in her leg was still there, a sharp, angry throb, but it felt distant now, like thunder rolling away after a lightning strike. She turned her head, wincing at the stiffness in her neck. Silas was asleep in a wooden chair nearby. His arms were folded across his broad chest, his boots were still on, and his head was slumped forward. He hadn't left her side. Her throat was desert dry, her lips cracked and peeling. She tried to speak, to ask for water, but no sound came out. Over the next 2 days, a quiet rhythm established itself. He never asked her any questions. He just tended to her. He changed her bandages. He spoon-fed her thin, warm broth that tasted of wild herbs. When she tried to get up, he would gently but firmly push her back down. "Not yet," he'd whisper, his voice rough but steady. When the silence grew too loud, when she found herself just staring blankly at the ceiling, lost in the wreckage of her own mind, he would pick up an old, tattered book with half its pages missing and read aloud. His voice was a low rumble, and she didn't understand most of the words, but the sound of it was a strange comfort. It was a way of filling the silence without breaking it. On the third day, she finally spoke. "Eloise," she whispered. Her voice was a dry, rasping thing, unused and fragile. He looked up from the knife he was sharpening. His eyes, she noticed, were the color of a winter sky, gray and deep. "My name," she clarified. He nodded once, a quick, sharp gesture. Then he went back to his knife, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel filling the quiet cabin. The world outside kept turning. The whispers in Dead Willow grew louder. Some called her a harlot, claiming she'd run off to the mysterious recluse on the ridge. Some said old Silas had finally gone mad from loneliness and grief. Others just watched the thin trail of smoke rising from his chimney with narrowed eyes and shook their heads. No one dared to visit. The wound on her leg was beginning to heal. The sharp edges of the pain were dulling. The angry swelling was starting to go down. But there was another wound, a deeper one, in her chest. The wound of betrayal, of abandonment. And that one bled quietly, constantly, beneath the surface. One morning she woke to find a small sprig of wild heather tucked beside her bowl of broth. There was no note, just the tiny purple flower. She stared at it for a long time, turning it over and over in her fingers. It was the first beautiful thing she had seen in so long. She tucked it carefully behind her ear. Later that afternoon, she worked up the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind. "Why?" she asked, her voice a little stronger now. "Why did you help me?" Silas was stirring a pot over the fire. He didn't turn around. He just kept stirring, the spoon making a slow, scraping sound against the iron. Finally, he spoke. "You look like someone no one was praying for," he said, his voice low. That didn't sit right. The words hung in the air between them, warmer than the fire. He wasn't a savior. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who saw something wrong and decided to do something right. But down in the town, Owen and Martha Carter were busy spinning their own story. A story of a wild, ungrateful girl who stole from them, a girl who shamed her dead husband's memory. They claimed she'd run off, that she'd stolen Jed's silver wedding ring and his rifle. The preacher nodded politely and offered them his prayers. Sheriff Pike just said he'd seen no proof of any theft. The town, for the most part, was content to believe the Carters. It was easier that way. But up on the ridge, in that quiet, slant-roofed cabin, something small was beginning to stir in Eloise. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something slower and softer. It was the simple, profound feeling of being seen. And for the first time in a very long time, Eloise let herself sleep without being afraid of waking up. She was still broken, yes, but in the quiet company of the gruff, silent man who had carried her out of the dust, she was no longer alone. and she was starting to wonder about the secrets he kept locked behind those winter gray eyes. What had brought a man like Silas Boone to hide himself away from the world? And why did the sheriff of Dead Willow seem so afraid of him? The days began to soften, blending into one another like the faded colors in an old quilt. Spring was coming to the high country, cautious at first, then with a sudden burst of green that painted the hills around the cabin. Eloise was healing, not just her leg, but something deeper. In the still, misty mornings, she would walk. At first, it was just a few steps on the porch, leaning heavily on a pair of crude but sturdy crutches Silas had carved for her from juniper wood. The wood was sanded smooth, warm to the touch. Each step was a victory. Each movement was a silent declaration. I am still here. The pain was a constant companion, a dull throb that sharpened when the air grew cold. But she learned to live with it. She learned that pain wasn't a stop sign. It was just a reminder of how far she had come. Silas rarely walked with her. He had an uncanny sense of when to give her space, when to let her fight her own battles. He'd watch from the porch, his face unreadable, while he worked a piece of wood with his knife. Small carvings would appear on the mantelpiece. A bird with its wings outstretched, a perfectly detailed oak leaf, a wolf with its head thrown back in a silent howl. He was a man who spoke with his hands. Down in Dead Willow, the gossip continued to churn. That Carter girl has him bewitched, they'd whisper over poker games in church pews. Old Silas has gone soft. Sheriff Pike had ridden up the trail once. He'd sat on his horse at the edge of the property for a long time, his boots crunching on the last of the frost. But he never got down, he never knocked. He just watched the cabin for a while, then turned his horse around and rode away. There were some men you didn't press without a very good reason, and Silas Boone was one of them. Inside the cabin, a new kind of life was taking root. It wasn't built on words, but on rhythms. Eloise learned to hobble to the stove, to peel apples with one hand while balancing on her crutches. She started adding herbs she found growing near the creek to the stew. One morning, Silas found a stack of warm biscuits on his plate. He didn't ask where they came from. He just nodded once and ate them. She started to piece together the fragments of his past. She learned his wife had died, childbirth, 5 winters ago. He never said her name, but it was carved into a cedar plank that hung above the stone hearth. Mary. Sometimes late at night when he thought she was asleep, she would see him just staring at that name, his face lost in a shadow she couldn't penetrate. There was a beautiful, hand-woven shawl hanging on a peg behind the bedroom door. It was dusty, untouched. Eloise knew it had been Mary's. She never asked about it. She never would. One afternoon, as the pale spring light spilled across the floorboards, she watched him whittling. His knife moved with a quiet, certain grace, shaping a scrap of maple into the delicate curve of a bird's wing. "You still afraid?" he asked, his eyes never leaving the piece of wood. The question came out of nowhere, catching her off guard. She thought for a moment, her gaze drifting to the window, to the wide open sky. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice soft. I think I forgot how not to be." He set his knife down and looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in a while. "That's all right," he said. "Fear ain't a weakness. It's just a thing you carry, until you set it down." That moment hung between them, not fragile, but solid and honest. Something shifted in Eloise after that. She started brushing her hair again, weaving it into a thick dark braid that hung down her back. She swept the porch clean every morning. She started to sing again, just quiet, half-forgotten hymns, melodies without names. Her voice, once as thin as paper, was starting to find its roots. One morning she walked outside alone, without her crutches. She left them leaning against the cabin door. The soft dirt gave way slightly under her feet, and she held her breath. But she held steady. The air tasted of pine and thawing earth, and she let it fill her lungs until they burned, a clean, good kind of pain. A squirrel darted across the woodpile. Birds chattered in the high branches. The world felt large but not hostile, not anymore. Silas watched her from the window, but he didn't come out. He gave her the dignity of her victory. That evening she was sitting on the porch steps when the town came back for her. She saw the dust cloud first, rising from the trail below. Then the sound of horses and the rattle of a buckboard. Owen Carter rode at the front, his belly straining the buttons of his stained vest, his eyes red-rimmed and mean. Martha sat beside him, her face a pinched mask of righteousness, her lips pursed so tight they had all but disappeared. And trailing behind them, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on God's green earth, was Sheriff Pike. Silas was on his feet before they even reached the sagging fence. He stepped off the porch, his arms crossed over his chest, his body a solid, unmoving wall. Inside, Eloise froze. The sound of that wagon, the sight of that man. It was a cold hand gripping her heart. "You got our kin, Boone," Owen shouted, his voice a nasty bark. "She ran from home, the little thief. We're here to take her back where she belongs." Silas just stood there, letting the silence stretch until it was thin and brittle. "She didn't run," he said finally, his voice a low growl. "You threw her away. I just picked her up." Martha leaned forward, her face sharp with scorn. "She's got things that don't belong to her. My boy's rifle, his wedding ring. She's a liar, and she's shamed his memory." The rifle. Why were they so obsessed with that old rifle? Jed had barely used it. It was just a plain, worn-out thing. Unless it wasn't. What if there was something else? Something they wanted back more than the rifle itself? Sheriff Pike cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his saddle. "Silas, maybe it's best she just comes back for a spell. Let things cool down. There's a lot of talk in town." "No law says I have to hand her over," Silas replied, his eyes locked on Owen. "And no law says you get to ignore what they did to her." Owen's hand drifted down, resting on the worn leather belt at his waist. The grip of a pistol gleamed in the afternoon sun. "You don't scare me, old man," he spat. And that's when a new voice cut through the tension. "You should be scared of what you did." Eloise. She stepped out of the cabin door. She wore one of Silas's old coats over her nightdress, and she was leaning on her crutches, but she stood tall. Her face was pale, but her eyes were burning. "You broke me," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the yard. "You left me in the street like a dog. But I didn't die, and I'm not coming back." Owen let out a bitter, ugly laugh. "You think he cares for you? This crazy old hermit? You think this is a home?" Eloise didn't flinch. "I know what home isn't," she said, "and it isn't with you." Martha's face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful little—" "She's not yours anymore," Silas interrupted, his voice like the closing of a tomb. Pike looked from the Carters' hateful faces to Eloise's defiant stare, to the unyielding wall that was Silas Boone. He let out a long, weary sigh. "This ain't worth a fight. If she wants to stay, that's her say. Unless you've got a court order, Owen, you got no legal hold on her." Owen cursed, a string of vile words that poisoned the clean mountain air. Martha hissed like a cornered snake. The wagon turned, slow and heavy, its wheels churning up the dust of their defeat. They rode back towards town without another word. Sheriff Pike lingered for a moment. He looked at Silas, then at Eloise. He tipped his hat. It was a small gesture, but it was more respect than anyone from Dead Willow had ever shown her. Then he too was gone. The silence that returned was different. It was softer, cleaner. Eloise sank onto the porch step, her legs suddenly trembling, the adrenaline leaving her weak. Silas sat down beside her, not too close, but not too far. "You all right?" he asked. "No," she said, a shaky breath escaping her lips. "But I think I will be." That night, a storm rolled over the ridge, and the rain came down in sheets, drumming on the roof like 1,000 distant hooves. Eloise stood at the window, watching lightning tear jagged scars across the dark sky. She didn't hide. She didn't shiver. Behind her, Silas was stoking the fire, the flames casting a warm, dancing glow across the cabin. She turned to him. "Thank you," she said. He looked up from the fire, and for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It was barely there, a faint lifting at the corners of his mouth. But it was warm enough to break something open in the darkness. "You don't owe me that," he said. "I know," she replied, "but I want to give it anyway." As she lay in her cot that night, listening to the rain and the wind, She wasn't listening for threats or footsteps anymore. She was listening to the quiet hum of something new being born. It was fragile, yes, but it was real. And as she drifted off to sleep, she didn't dream of falling, or breaking, or drowning. She dreamed of standing her ground. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the Carters weren't finished. They hadn't just been angry. They had been desperate. And a desperate man is the most dangerous animal of all. They hadn't just wanted her back. They wanted something she had, or something they thought she had, and they would be back to get it. The forest floor after a fire is a strange sight. It's blackened and scarred, but it's also cleared. It's ready for new growth. That's what Eloise felt like. The confrontation with the Carters had burned away the last of her fear, leaving behind something harder, something more resilient. She no longer needed the crutches. A slight limp remained, a ghost of the break, but she wore it like a medal, a testament to the battle she had won. She spent her days in the small garden Silas had helped her till behind the cabin. Her hands, once scraped raw from the dirt of Main Street, were now calloused from honest work, from pulling weeds and planting seeds. Life with Silas fell into a comfortable, unspoken rhythm. They were two solitary souls who had found a way to be solitary together. He would chop wood while she kneaded bread. She would mend his torn shirts while he cleaned his rifle. They rarely spoke of the past. Her past was a landscape of pain, and his was a locked room she didn't have the key for. But sometimes she would catch him looking at her, a strange expression in his winter gray eyes, a mix of sorrow and something else she couldn't quite name. The town of Dead Willow kept its distance, but something had shifted. The story of her standing up to Owen Carter had spread. One morning they found a bundle at the gate of the property, a dozen eggs wrapped in a clean cloth, and a hand-scrawled note that simply said, "For the bird lady." It was from the preacher's boy. Later that week, the blacksmith rode by. He didn't stop, but he met Eloise's eyes and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't pity, it was respect. The town was beginning to see her not as a victim, but as a survivor. But peace, like a spring bloom, is a fragile thing. It was late one afternoon when the rumble of hooves returned. This time, it was different. It wasn't the clumsy rattle of a farm wagon. It was the sound of purpose, of menace. Eloise was inside, sorting dried beans. Silas was on the porch, sharpening his knife. He heard it first. He went still, his head cocked, his whole body tensed like a wolf sensing danger on the wind. He stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, his eyes scanning the trail below. Three riders emerged from the trees. Owen Carter was in the lead, but his face was different. The bluster was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Beside him was a man Eloise didn't recognize, a stranger with a city-tailored coat and dead, empty eyes. And behind them, a third man with a long rifle slung across his back, his face hidden in shadow. These weren't neighbors. These were hired guns. "Thought you were told she wasn't coming back," Silas said, his voice dangerously calm. Owen dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. "We're not here for talk, Boone." He gestured to the cabin. "I want what's mine. Jed's rifle, his books, all of my kin's belongings." The rifle again. What was it about that rifle? Jed had won it in a card game, she remembered him saying. It was old, the stock scarred and dark with age. "She ain't got none of that," Silas replied, his body positioned squarely between them and the cabin door. "I don't believe you," Owen sneered. He took a step forward. The mercenary with the dead eyes raised his rifle, the movement smooth and practiced. And then the wind changed. Eloise smelled it first. Smoke, sharp and wrong. Not the familiar scent of the hearth fire. This was the smell of dry hay and old wood catching flame. She spun around and saw it through the rear window. A flicker of orange, a plume of greasy black smoke. They'd set the barn on fire. Silas saw it too, and for a split second, his attention was divided. And that split second was all Owen needed. He lunged, not at Silas, but towards the cabin door. The rifleman raised his weapon, aiming it squarely at Silas's chest. "Let it burn!" Owen barked, a wild, triumphant look in his eyes. "Let her watch everything she has turn to ash." But Eloise was already moving. She burst through the door, her face carved from stone, her eyes blazing with a fire of their own. "Stop!" she screamed. All three men turned, surprised by her sudden appearance. "She doesn't have anything of value," Silas said again, stepping in front of her, trying to shield her. "I do," Eloise said, her voice quiet but ringing with clarity. "I have my name." Owen sneered. "A name don't matter when no one believes it." "Maybe not in town," she replied. "But here, it does." The rifleman hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger. This was getting more complicated than he'd been paid for. And then another sound cut through the crackle of the fire. Hoofbeats, more hoofbeats, coming up the trail fast. It was the blacksmith, and behind him, two other townsmen armed with hunting rifles. And trailing them all, looking grim and determined, was Sheriff Pike. They'd seen the smoke. Or maybe, just maybe, they had finally seen enough. Pike dismounted, his face a thundercloud. "That's arson, Owen." "She's a thief!" Owen spat, his plan crumbling around him. "She's a survivor," the blacksmith cut in, his voice a low rumble. "And you ought to ride out of here before that fire spreads to more than just wood." Owen's mouth opened and closed like a fish on a hook. He looked at the armed townsman, at the furious sheriff, at the unyielding man on the porch, and at the girl who refused to break. For the first time, he looked small. He looked beaten. He mounted his horse without another word. The hired guns, seeing their payday disappear in a cloud of smoke, followed suit. There were no more threats, no more gunfire, just the angry crackle of the fire eating what little they had. As they disappeared down the trail, Eloise finally sagged, the strength leaving her in a rush. Silas was there, catching her before she could fall. She didn't cry, not then. Later, after the men from town had helped them put out the fire, when the sky was bruised with twilight and smoke, she stood in the smoldering ruins of the barn. Only embers and blackened timbers remained. Silas came and stood beside her. "I should be angry," she said, her voice thick with smoke and exhaustion. "You're allowed to be," he replied. She shook her head, staring into the glowing coals. "I'm not. I feel free." He looked at her, surprised. "They burned the last piece of who I used to be," she continued, a strange sense of calm settling over her. "They burned the place where they hurt me. Now I don't have to carry it anymore." Silas didn't reply, but he reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out. It was one of his carvings, a flame, shaped from a piece of rich red cedar. It was still warm from his pocket. He pressed it into her palm. Her fingers closed around its smooth, curved grooves. "Still standing," he said, his voice soft. "Still learning how," she replied. The loss didn't feel like an end. It felt like a clearing, like the forest after a fire. Blackened, yes, but ready. Ready for whatever came next. And as she stood there clutching the wooden flame, a memory surfaced. Jed showing her the old rifle, tapping the butt plate. "Family secrets, Ellie Mae," he'd whispered with a wink. "Richest dirt in the county is right where you'd least expect it." She had thought he was joking. A secret, hidden in the rifle. That's what they were after. It wasn't about her at all. It was about greed. And now they thought the secret had burned with the barn. But she knew better. Because before the Carters had come the first time, Silas, worried about Owen's claims, had taken the rifle and hidden it somewhere safe, deep in the woods. The secret wasn't lost, and now it was hers. The morning wind no longer carried a chill. It smelled of creek water and wild roses, a world washed clean. Eloise stood in her garden, her feet planted firmly in the rich, dark earth. Her limp was all but gone, a faint memory in the rhythm of her stride. She was planting seeds, her dirt-streaked fingers tucking them into the soil with a gentle, practiced care. Silas watched her from the porch. A quiet peace had settled between them, a comfortable silence that didn't need to be filled with words. He had started fixing things, mending the fence, patching the roof, reinforcing an old chicken coop that hadn't seen a chicken in years. It was as if by rebuilding the physical world around them, they were rebuilding their own souls. They had fallen into a life, not an easy one, not one free from scars, but an honest one. They hadn't spoken of the Carters since the fire. The town had shunned them completely. Owen was a pariah, a man consumed by his own bitterness. Eloise no longer woke with a knot of fear in her stomach. Her sleep was deep and dreamless. It was just before dusk when the storm returned. Not a storm of clouds and rain, but of hoofbeats and hatred. She heard it first, a distant, hollow drumming on the trail, a sound that spoke of finality. Silas heard it too. He didn't tense up. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just went utterly, dangerously still. He stepped off the porch, his boots heavy against the earth, and walked to the edge of the clearing to meet them. 3 riders. The same 3. Owen Carter, his face gaunt and his eyes lit with a feverish, cruel light. The hired rifleman. And another man, younger, leaner, with a gunslinger's swagger and cold, assessing eyes. This wasn't about intimidation anymore. This was an execution. Eloise walked to the edge of the garden and stopped. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but she did not retreat. Her hand curled around the small garden trowel she'd been using, a sliver of cold steel in her palm. Owen reined in his horse, a cloud of dust billowing around him. "I warned you, Boone," he said, his voice ragged with venom. "I told you this wasn't finished." "You burned a man's barn," Silas replied, his voice level. "Seems like you already finished it." "She stole from us," Owen shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Eloise. "That rifle held our family's future, a map to the old silver claim. Jed was going to cut us out, and she was in on it. She shamed my family." "She survived your family," Silas cut in, "and you couldn't stand it." Owen's face twitched, his hand tightening on the reins. The young gunman dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He brushed back his coat, revealing the polished handle of a Colt revolver nestled in a holster tied low on his thigh. "I ain't here to argue," Owen said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "She tells us where that rifle is hidden, or things get messy." Eloise stepped forward, the trowel still clutched in her hand. "I'm not yours," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I never was." "You were my son's wife," Owen spat. "I was your servant," she shot back, her eyes unflinching, "until you decided even that was too much." The young gunman cracked his neck and took a step forward, his hand hovering over his holster. Silas didn't even blink. "Leave," he said. The word was not a request. "While that's still a choice," Owen grinned, a sickening, humorless expression. "We'll take the map. You can die defending her, or you can step aside." For a single heartbeat, the entire world went silent. The birds stopped singing. The wind died. Then the gunman drew. He was fast, wickedly fast. The crack of the shot was like a thunderclap echoing off the trees. Smoke billowed from the pistol's barrel. But Silas had already moved. He wasn't a simple recluse. He wasn't just a quiet man who carved wood. In that explosive moment, Eloise saw what the sheriff had seen. The coiled stillness, the economy of motion, the lethal grace of a man who had known violence intimately. He moved not with panic, but with a brutal, practiced precision. He lunged, shoving Eloise down and behind him as the bullet tore through the air, where her heart had been a second before. The shot grazed his side, a hot poker that ripped through his coat and nicked flesh. A dark stain of blood began to bloom on the fabric. Before the gunman could fire a second time, Silas drew a pistol that seemed to appear from nowhere. He fired once. The shot was deafening. The young gunman staggered backward, a look of pure surprise on his face, before collapsing into the dust like a dropped sack of grain. The rifleman on the horse fumbled to raise his own weapon, but Eloise was already scrambling to her feet. Fueled by adrenaline and rage, she grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet she'd left by the outdoor wash basin. With a guttural scream, she hurled it with all her might. It spun through the air like a deadly discus, catching the rifleman square on the wrist with a sickening crunch of bone and a hiss of pain. He shrieked, dropping his rifle, clutching his shattered hand. Owen Carter stared, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. His hired muscle was down. His plan was in ruins. The coward that had always lived beneath his bluster finally showed its face. He backed his horse away, his hands raised in surrender. Silas stepped forward, blood dripping from his side, but his hand was steady, his pistol aimed directly at Owen's chest. "You so much as twitch," Silas said, his voice a low, deadly whisper. And I will drop you where you sit. Owen swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. This, this was supposed to scare you. You already tried that, Silas said. Didn't take. Eloise walked towards him now, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes burning like coals. You came here to kill us, she said. You failed. She was always trouble, Owen muttered, his eyes darting around wildly. Should have finished it the day Jed died. And yet, Eloise said, stopping just a few feet from his horse, here I am, still standing. Sheriff Pike arrived moments later, drawn by the sound of the gunshots. He took one look at the scene, the dead man in the dust, the whimpering rifleman, the blood on Silas's shirt, and the unholy terror in Owen Carter's eyes. And he understood everything. He cuffed Owen himself, a grim satisfaction on his face. As he led him away, a broken and pathetic man, he turned to Eloise. You all right, ma'am? She nodded, her body finally starting to tremble. He looked at Silas, at the growing bloodstain on his side. And you? Silas, pale but upright, just grunted. Fixin' to be. The last shadow of the Carters rolled away down the trail, leaving silence in its wake. Inside the cabin, Eloise cleaned Silas's wound. Her hands, to her own surprise, were perfectly steady. He hissed once as she pressed a cloth soaked in whiskey to the torn flesh, but he didn't complain. She stitched the skin with a needle and thread from her mending basket, her movements slow and careful. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of everything that had just happened, of a shared survival that needed no words. Afterward, he lay on the cot, his eyes closed. She sat in the chair beside him, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest in the flickering candlelight. I thought I'd be afraid, she whispered into the quiet room. He opened one eye. Were you? No, she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. Not anymore. You saved me, she added, her voice thick with emotion. He closed his eye again, a faint smile on his own lips. No, he said. You'd already saved yourself. I just held the door open. They didn't speak of love. It wasn't the time, and it wasn't the word for what they had. What had passed between them was something deeper, something forged in fire and fear and rooted in the hard soil of survival. It was the kind of connection that didn't bloom fast, but when it did, it was strong enough to withstand any storm. A week passed, then two. The garden grew. The roof no longer leaked. The wind blew clean over the ridge. Sheriff Pike had come by once to tell them the circuit judge had sentenced Owen Carter to 20 years of hard labor for arson and attempted murder. The rifle with its hidden map was now legally Eloise's. She and Silas had followed its cryptic clues to a small hidden cave not half a mile from the cabin and found an old lockbox filled with enough silver to buy the whole town of Dead Willow twice over. But they didn't. One morning, when the sky was blushed with the pink of dawn, Eloise stepped outside. She stood tall in the soft grass, barefoot, with no limp at all. She turned towards the porch, towards Silas. He was standing in the doorway, a cup of coffee in his hands, watching her like a man seeing the sun for the very first time after a long, cold winter. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. He nodded once, a slow, deep acknowledgement of everything they had been through, and she smiled back. A voice deep inside her whispered a truth she finally believed. You made it. You endured. You did not break. Not every rescue comes with guns drawn. Sometimes salvation looks like a quiet man with sad eyes and kind hands. And sometimes the broken ones are the only ones strong enough to carry each other until one day they don't feel broken at all. So if the world ever leaves you in the dust, if it ever breaks you and tells you you're worthless, you remember the story of Eloise May Carter. You remember that there's always one soul out there stubborn enough to see your worth. And when you find that soul, or when you find that strength inside yourself, you stand tall, even if you have to learn how all over again. If you enjoyed Eloise's journey from the dust to the dawn and believe that everyone deserves a second chance to stand, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. You never know whose story we'll tell next.